Hello everyone. Today we follow a heartbreaking journey filled with pain and unexpected twists in the life of a young girl named Tieu Hue, a story of love, escape, and survival. Alongside the darkness, there are still kind-hearted people willing to help those in need. If you enjoy stories about lytuteu, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support us. Inside the suffocating darkness of what should have been the happiest day of her life, Tieu Hue sat curled up in the corner of a luxurious yet cold wedding car. Tears streamed down her pale face as the engine roared along the narrow road. She looked down at her wedding dress, but to her, it felt like heavy chains tightening around her future. The cruel truth flooded her mind. The groom, a man she had never met, had not even shown up. This was nothing more than a transaction. She was the product her own brother had sold to pay off his gambling debts. The man she was being handed to was wealthy but infamous, surrounded by scandals, multiple wives, and disturbing desires. Her heart tightened as she imagined facing those other women, victims like herself, now looking at her with jealousy and calculation. Outside the car, whispers and mocking laughter from curious onlookers cut deeply into her dignity. They laughed at a wedding without a groom. They ridiculed her fate as someone traded like a luxury object. Despair suffocated her, making every breath harder. She questioned how her life had fallen into such darkness. Suddenly, a loud crash shook the car violently. Chaos erupted as the convoy struggled to handle the unexpected incident. In that moment of confusion, a fragile hope flickered in her tear-filled eyes. She knew if she didn't run now, she would be trapped forever. Without hesitation, she pushed the door open and threw herself out with all the strength she had left. Her bare feet hit the cold ground as she ran wildly toward the dark forest ahead. Her wedding dress tore apart on thorny branches, her skin scratched and bleeding, but she didn't stop. Behind her, angry shouts exploded. "Catch her! Don't let her escape!" The voices chased her like ghosts. She didn't dare look back. She ran deeper into the darkness, her breath ragged, her heart pounding as if it would burst. Each step was a gamble with fate. In the suffocating darkness of the forest, fear consumed her, but deep inside, her desire to live and be free burned stronger than anything else. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know if there was a way out. She only knew one thing: she had to keep running. As darkness fully covered the forest, Tieu Hue realized she had completely lost her way. She stood at countless unclear paths, surrounded by towering trees whose branches stretched out like monstrous arms in the night. Her eyes blurred with tears and dust, but she didn't dare stop, not even for a moment. The fear of being captured and dragged back into that cold wedding car was far greater than her fear of darkness or wild animals. She kept moving aimlessly. Her bare feet were now bleeding and numb from sharp stones and thorny bushes. Every rustle of dry leaves or whistle of the wind made her heart pound, as she mistook them for the footsteps of those chasing her. Exhaustion began to break her spirit. Hunger and thirst tormented her frail body. Her throat burned dry, her breathing grew uneven, and her heartbeat pounded violently in her chest. In the silence of the deep forest, memories of her late parents suddenly surfaced. The warmth of her family felt like a distant dream, painfully vivid. She whispered their names through trembling sobs, questioning why life had taken everything she loved, only to push her into a fate where her own brother had sold her like a worthless object. Loneliness overwhelmed her. She felt like a fragile leaf in the middle of a storm, with nothing to hold onto and no escape in sight. At one point, she wanted to give up, to collapse under a giant tree and let fate decide everything. But then, The image of the hellish life waiting for her with that wealthy man and his cruel wives flashed through her mind like a warning. It forced her to stand up again. Dragging her body through dense bushes, her torn clothes covered in mud, the once beautiful bride had now become nothing more than a ghostly white figure wandering in the forest. After hours of struggling against exhaustion, as faint moonlight began to slip through the leaves, Tieu Hue suddenly stopped. In the distance, she saw a faint light. She rubbed her eyes, thinking it was just an illusion caused by hunger, but it wasn't. It was a small house, perched on the mountainside. A fragile yet powerful hope ignited within her. She knew that might be her only chance to survive, the only place that could save her from the hunters behind her. Ignoring her trembling legs, she gathered every last bit of strength and moved toward that light. Her mind held only one thought: she had to reach that house before her body gave out completely. Her fight against death and despair had reached its most intense moment. Using the last of her remaining strength, Tieu Hue struggled to crawl up the steep hillside. Her fragile hands clutched tightly onto sharp wild grass, cutting into her palms and leaving streaks of fresh blood. The light from the wooden house above shone like a distant lighthouse, the only hope in her dark world. But just as she was only a few steps away, a sudden wave of dizziness struck her. The ground beneath her seemed to spin violently. Her exhausted legs could no longer support her weakened body on the wet soil left behind by the recent forest rain. She slipped. Her small body tumbled down the rocky slope, rolling uncontrollably. Each collision with tree trunks and jagged stones sent waves of pain through her, but she could not even scream, her breath had already run out. At last, her injured body came to a stop in front of a wooden gate belonging to a lonely farmhouse. With the last flicker of consciousness, she caught a blurred glimpse of the house before her eyes slowly closed. She collapsed into the terrifying silence of the forest, her breathing faint like a candle about to be extinguished. At that very moment, Tuan, a rugged man with a determined gaze, was outside, holding a lantern as he checked the fence after hearing a strange noise. The dim yellow light revealed a white figure lying motionless on the ground. Startled, he stepped closer, lowering the lantern to see more clearly. Shock filled his face when he realized it was a young woman in a torn wedding dress. Her face was pale as if drained of life, her hair messy and covered in mud, and her skin marked with countless scratches. He placed his hand gently on her neck, feeling a weak but persistent pulse, a fragile life still clinging on. He knew she was not from this area, and the appearance of a bride deep in the forest could only mean one thing: a painful story hidden behind her presence. Without hesitation, he set aside his usual caution and lifted the unconscious girl into his arms. His strong hands supported her weightless body as he rushed into the house, placing her carefully onto a warm wooden bed. This was not just an act of rescue, it was the moment fate intertwined two strangers, marking the beginning of a journey neither of them could have foreseen. In the quiet space, with only the soft crackling of firewood in the fireplace, Tuan silently watched over the unconscious woman, unknowingly stepping into a challenging path of care and protection ahead. The gentle light from the oil lamp on the wooden table illuminated Tieu Hue's face as she slowly regained consciousness from her long, dream-filled sleep. The first thing she felt was not the cold of the forest, but the warmth of a thick blanket wrapped around her body. Startled, she sat up quickly, her eyes filled with caution as she looked around the unfamiliar room. But her anxiety gradually eased when she saw Tuan quietly sitting by the fire. He did not approach her, afraid of frightening her. Instead, he gently pushed a bowl of warm water and a set of clean clothes toward her. His voice was calm and steady, telling her to stay calm because this place was safe, no one would chase her here. Tieu Hue took the warm drink from his hands. The rising steam and the faint scent of forest leaves helped soothe her mind. Looking down at her hands, now carefully bandaged, she felt the quiet care of this stranger. The warmth inside the small wooden house stood in sharp contrast to the cruelty she had just escaped, slowly breaking down the walls she had built around her heart. Under the flickering firelight, Tieu Hue began to tell her story. Her voice trembled as she spoke about her gambling-addicted brother, who had heartlessly sold her like an object to pay off his debts. She spoke of the horror of being forced into a wedding dress, sent to become a concubine to a wealthy but twisted man. Each word carried her pain. Tears fell into the cup she held. She spoke of her loneliness and despair in the forest, that moment when she would have rather died than returned to a life of captivity and humiliation. Tuan listened in silence. His eyes reflected both empathy and quiet anger at her fate. Behind her fragile appearance, he saw a strong will to live, a soul burning with the desire for freedom. For the first time in years, Tieu Hue felt seen as a human being, respected and heard, not treated as something to be traded. Tuan did not make empty promises, but his actions, offering her shelter and safety, spoke louder than words. Outside, the night still covered the mountains in darkness. But inside the wooden house, an invisible bond began to form between two wounded souls. Tuan started to think about what he needed to do to hide her identity and protect her if those pursuing her ever found this place. He knew keeping her would bring trouble to his quiet life. But as he looked into her tearful eyes, he realized one thing clearly: he could not leave her alone in this cruel world ever again. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the leaves and the mist still lingered on the mountain peaks, Tuan had already woken up early. He lit the fire and carefully prepared a bowl of hot porridge, adding chopped green onions and fresh herbs from the garden to help Tieu Hue recover after her exhausting night. When she woke up and saw the steaming bowl placed on the table, a strange sense of peace quietly filled her heart, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The two sat across from each other in the small wooden house, slowly beginning to talk about simple things in life, the joy of watching a plant sprout, or the gentle sound of birds singing outside the quiet porch. Through these small, scattered conversations, they gradually began to understand each other about their painful pasts and the silent dreams they both carried of having a real home. Life in the mountains passed in a temporary calm. Tieu Hue learned how to take care of the farm, how to care for herself, and how to appreciate the freedom she had risked her life to gain. She realized that happiness did not lie in wealth or luxury, like what her brother or that rich man had, but in genuine care and small acts of kindness from Tuan. Yet, even in these peaceful moments, danger still lurked beyond the forest. Her dark past and those who chased her had not given up. Every unfamiliar sound from the foot of the mountain or the appearance of strangers in nearby villages brought tension and unease between them. Tuan would always hold her hand tightly, a silent promise that he would protect her no matter what dangers lay ahead. The story closes with an open ending. Hope for a new life begins to grow, but the shadows of danger have not yet disappeared, leaving both anticipation and worry for the future of two hearts that have just found each other. If you enjoyed this journey of freedom and love, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to support us. Your support is the greatest motivation for us to continue telling meaningful and emotional stories like this. Thank you, and see you in the next episode.
Ngay khi nhận được tin căn nhà tre bị lũ cuốn trôi, Trường không chần chừ một giây nào, anh bỏ lại mọi việc, ngay lập tức chạy về khu rừng nơi tiểu nữ đang ở. Đường đi bị bùn đất chắn ngang, nhiều đoạn đường gần như không thể di chuyển, nhưng anh vẫn cố tìm cách đi tiếp. Với anh lúc này, việc căn nhà bị phá hủy không còn quan trọng nữa. Điều duy nhất anh cần biết là hai mẹ con có còn an toàn hay không. Khi đến nơi, cảnh tượng trước mặt khiến anh khựng lại. Căn nhà tre đã không còn hình dạng ban đầu mà chỉ còn lại những mảnh gỗ vỡ. Mái lá đã bị cuốn đi, mọi thứ ngổn ngang sau khi trận lũ quét qua.